On the morning of November 1st, 1765, church bells across the American colonies did not ring. Courts did not open. Ships stayed in harbour, their papers unstamped, their cargoes unloaded, their captains unwilling to risk the penalties. Newspapers published their final editions on unstamped paper, some with black borders, as if in mourning. In Portsmouth, New Hampshire, the local publisher put a skull and crossbones where the stamp should have gone, and beneath it a single word: expiring. In Philadelphia, the city bells tolled as if for a funeral, and a crowd gathered to bury an effigy of the stamp distributor who had wisely resigned his post the day before. In Boston, the stamp distributor's house was surrounded by an angry crowd. In New York, the governor locked himself in Fort George. This was not a riot. This was an organized, continent-wide act of civil disobedience. And it had been coordinated across 13 separate colonies that had never, in the 158 years since Jamestown, acted in unison on anything. The Stamp Act was scheduled to take effect on November 1st, 1765. It never did. It was dead before it was born. But in dying, it gave birth to something far more dangerous, to the British Empire at least, than a tax on paper. It gave birth to the idea that the American colonies could function as a single political entity, that they had common interests, that their destiny was not to remain a loose collection of British provinces, but to become a nation. And like so many of the events that led to the American Revolution, the Stamp Act was never intended to be any of these things. The men who designed it thought they were solving a modest fiscal problem. They were, as is so often the case with imperial administrators, the last people on earth to understand what they had actually done. Let us begin with the debt, because everything. They were, as is so often the case with imperial administrators, the last people on earth to understand what they had actually done. Let us begin with the debt, because everything begins with the debt. By 1763, Britain had spent more than £100 million fighting the 7 Years' War. The national debt had nearly doubled. The interest payments alone consumed more than half of the government's annual budget. Somebody had to pay. And from the perspective of the British political class, the logic was inescapable. The war had been fought at enormous expense, largely for the benefit of the American colonies. The French had been driven from Canada. The frontier had been secured. The colonists were the primary beneficiaries of a victory that had nearly bankrupted the mother country. Surely, they could be asked to contribute something to the cost of their own defence. There was an additional expense that sharpened this logic. After Pontiac's War, the British government had decided to station 10,000 regular troops in North America, not to oppress the colonists, but to police the vast new territories acquired from France, and to maintain peace between settlers and native nations. These troops were expensive. Their annual cost was estimated at £300,000, and from London's perspective, it seemed perfectly reasonable that the people being protected should help pay for the protection. This was not, in the abstract, an unreasonable position. The British were not monsters. The men who governed the empire were not cartoon villains cackling over their plans to enslave the colonists. They were practical administrators confronting a genuine fiscal crisis. The British people themselves were heavily taxed, far more heavily than the colonists. The average Briton paid 25 shillings a year in taxes. The average American colonist paid about sixpence. The disparity was enormous. From London's perspective, the colonies were getting a free ride, but this perspective completely misunderstood the nature of the relationship between Britain and its American colonies. And the man who understood this better than anyone, the man who saw the Stamp Act coming and tried futilely to warn London, was Benjamin Franklin. Franklin was in London in 1765, serving as an agent for Pennsylvania. He was the most famous American in the world. He was also, at this point in his life, a committed British patriot who believed that the future of the colonies lay within the empire. He wanted to make the relationship work, and when the Stamp Act was being debated in Parliament, Franklin tried to explain to the British government why it was a catastrophic mistake. The problem, Franklin argued, was not the amount of the tax. The amount was actually quite modest. A stamp on legal documents cost a few pennies. A stamp on a newspaper cost a halfpenny. A stamp on a deck of playing cards cost a shilling. These were not burdensome sums. The colonists were not going to be impoverished by paying a few extra pence on their legal papers. The problem was the principle. The Stamp Act was the first direct internal tax that Britain had ever imposed on the American colonies. Previous taxes had been external, by paying a few extra pence on their legal papers. The problem was the principle. The Stamp Act was the first direct internal tax that Britain had ever imposed on the American colonies. Previous taxes had been external, customs duties on imported goods, trade regulations, navigation laws. The colonists had grumbled about these, but they had paid them because they could be justified as measures to regulate commerce, which was within the Crown's traditional authority. An internal tax was different. An internal tax was an assertion that the British Parliament had the right to reach into the pocket of every American colonist and take their money, without their consent, without their representation, without any voice in the decision whatsoever. Franklin tried to explain this to the British ministers. He told them that the colonists would not accept it. He told them that the Stamp Act would be met with resistance. He told them that they were lighting a fire they would not be able to control. They did not listen. George Grenville, the Prime Minister, was a man of formidable intelligence and zero imagination. He could balance a budget. He could draft legislation. He could not understand why anyone would object to a perfectly reasonable tax. When American agents in London warned him of the consequences, he dismissed their concerns. The colonists, he believed, would grumble for a while and then pay up, just as they always had. He was catastrophically wrong. But before we get to the reaction, let us understand exactly what the Stamp Act taxed, because the list is revealing. It was not a random assortment of items. It was a tax on every form of communication and commerce that mattered to colonial life. Newspapers, legal documents, diplomas, playing cards, insurance policies, ships' papers, deeds, wills, almanacs, licenses, contracts. Every one of these documents, from a merchant's bill of lading to a farmer's marriage license, now required a stamp. A small, embossed piece of paper purchased from a Crown-appointed stamp distributor. Without the stamp, the document was legally invalid. A will without a stamp was void. A contract without a stamp was unenforceable. A newspaper without a stamp could not be published. Think about what this meant in practice. The Stamp Act did not merely tax the colonists. It inserted the Crown into every transaction, every legal proceeding, every publication. It made the imperial government a silent partner in every aspect of colonial life. A merchant could not ship goods without the Crown's stamp. A lawyer could not file a case. A couple could not marry. A deceased man's estate could not be settled. The stamp was the Crown's presence, its authority made visible, its power made inescapable. And the colonists were expected to pay this tax in hard currency, British sterling, at a time when hard currency was desperately scarce in the colonies. The colonial economy ran on credit, on barter, on a hodgepodge of provincial paper money. Demanding payment in sterling was, for many colonists, equivalent to demanding payment in gold dust. The men who would be responsible for collecting this tax were the stamp distributors, appointed by the Crown, paid a commission on their collections, and answerable not to any colonial authority, but to the British Treasury. They were the face of the Stamp Act, and they would become the most hated men in America. Now, the reaction. The Stamp Act was passed by Parliament in March of 1765. It was not scheduled to take effect until November 1st. For 7 months, the colonists had time to think about what it meant. And what they thought, increasingly, was that it meant they were being treated not as free British subjects, but as a conquered people. The first organized response came from the Virginia House of Burgesses in May. A young lawyer named Patrick Henry, 29 years old, brilliant, reckless, a man whose oratory could make a room of hardened politicians weep or rage, introduced a series of resolutions declaring that only the Virginia Assembly had the right to tax Virginians. The older, more conservative members of the House were alarmed by Henry's language. The debate grew heated. At one point, Henry declared that Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell, and George III. Here he was interrupted by cries of treason from the floor. Henry paused. He looked around the chamber, and then he finished the sentence. May profit by their example. If this be treason, make the most of it. The Virginia resolves passed by a single vote. The governor dissolved the House of Burgesses the next day, but it was too late. The resolutions were printed in newspapers up and down the coast. Virginia had spoken, and the other colonies were listening. In Boston, the response was more visceral. The city was already a powder keg, overcrowded, economically stagnant, full of unemployed sailors and resentful merchants who had been hit hard by the post-war economic downturn. The Stamp Act gave the city's anger a target. In August, a crowd hung an effigy of Andrew Oliver, the newly appointed stamp distributor for Massachusetts, from an elm tree that would become known as the Liberty Tree. They beheaded the effigy. They burned it. Then they marched to Oliver's house, broke his windows, and destroyed his furniture. Oliver resigned the next day. 2 weeks later, a larger crowd attacked the home of Thomas Hutchinson, the Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts. Hutchinson was not even the stamp distributor. He was merely a senior royal official, a man who had spent his life in service to the colony, a proud New Englander who believed in the empire. The crowd did not care. They gutted his house. They destroyed his furniture, his library, his collection of historical manuscripts, priceless documents relating to the early history of Massachusetts that Hutchinson had spent decades assembling. They left the building a smoking shell. This was not protest. This was mob violence, and it terrified the colonial elite. Men like John Adams, who would later become the second president of the United States, watched the destruction of Hutchinson's house with horror. He wrote in his diary that the violence was disgraceful, that it harmed the colonial cause, that it proved the British right about the savagery of the American rabble. But Adams also understood something deeper. The violence was not random. It was targeted. It was directed at the agents of the Stamp Act, and only at the agents of the Stamp Act. The mob had destroyed Hutchinson's house not because Hutchinson was a loyalist, but because he symbolized the imperial order the Stamp Act represented. The mob was making a political statement, however ugly its methods. And the statement worked. By November 1st, every single stamp distributor in the American colonies had resigned. Every single one. Without distributors, there was no one to sell the stamps. Without stamps, the Stamp Act could not be enforced. But the colonists did not stop there. They understood that the Stamp Act could only be defeated if the colonies acted together. And so, in October of 1765, 27 delegates from 9 colonies gathered in New York City for what became known as the Stamp Act Congress. It was the first intercolonial gathering convened specifically to oppose a British policy. And it was, by any measure, an extraordinary event. These delegates did not know each other. They came from colonies that had different economies, different religions, different political traditions. Massachusetts was Puritan. Virginia was Anglican. Pennsylvania was Quaker. New York was a commercial hub. South Carolina was a plantation society. Connecticut was a collection of small farms. These colonies had spent more time squabbling with each other than cooperating. They had boundary disputes, trade rivalries, religious animosities. They were not a nation. They were barely even neighbours. And yet, in the space of 2 weeks, they produced a document of remarkable force and clarity. The Declaration of Rights and Grievances, drafted largely by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, asserted that the colonists possessed all the rights of Englishmen, that no taxes could be imposed upon them without their consent, and that they could not be represented in Parliament because of the practical impossibility of sending colonial representatives to London. The Stamp Act, they declared, was unconstitutional, unjust, and must be repealed. The language was measured, the tone was respectful. The delegates took pains to profess their loyalty to the Crown, but the substance was revolutionary. For the first time, the American colonies had spoken with a single voice, and the voice said, "No." But the Stamp Act Congress alone would not have been enough to force repeal. The British government had faced colonial protests before. It had weathered political storms. What made the Stamp Act different, what made it impossible to enforce, was the economic pressure the colonists brought to bear. The weapon was the non-importation agreement. It was devastatingly simple. Colonial merchants agreed to stop importing British goods. No cloth from Manchester, no tools from Sheffield, no tea from the East India Company, no luxury goods of any kind. The colonists would make their own clothes, grow their own food, produce their own necessities. They would freeze the British economy out of the American market until the Stamp Act was repealed. This was not a symbolic gesture. The American colonies were the largest market for British manufactured goods in the world. British merchants, already struggling with the post-war economic downturn, suddenly watched their American orders collapse. Warehouses filled with unsold goods, factories laid off workers. Shipbuilders in Liverpool and Bristol saw their vessels sitting idle in port. The economic pain radiated through the British economy like a shockwave. And British merchants, unlike American colonists, had representation in Parliament. They had members of Parliament who depended on their support, and they made their anger known. By the winter of 1765, a delegation of London merchants was pounding on the doors of Parliament demanding repeal. They were not motivated by sympathy for colonial rights. They were motivated by bankruptcy. But the effect was the same. In January of 1766, Parliament began debating repeal. The debate was fierce and revealing. The defenders of the Stamp Act argued that to repeal it would be to surrender parliamentary authority. If the colonists could nullify one act of Parliament by refusing to comply, they could nullify any act. The empire would dissolve. George Grenville, the architect of the Stamp Act, gave a speech in the House of Commons that was, by all accounts, brilliant and implacable. He accused the colonists of sedition. He warned that retreat would be fatal. He demanded that the act be enforced by military force if necessary. But the political ground had shifted beneath his feet. A new ministry, led by the Marquis of Rockingham, had replaced Grenville's government. Rockingham was a moderate who understood that the Stamp Act was unenforceable. He also understood that British merchants were hemorrhaging money and that they would not tolerate the continuation of a policy that was destroying their livelihoods. And then Benjamin Franklin testified before the House of Commons. This was one of the pivotal moments of the pre-revolutionary era. Franklin stood before Parliament for 4 hours, answering questions from hostile members, and he demolished the case for the Stamp Act with a combination of wit, data, and quiet moral clarity. He explained that the colonists would never pay the stamp tax, not because they could not afford it, but because they considered it an assault on their rights as Englishmen. He explained that the colonists had always accepted external trade duties, but that an internal tax was different in kind. He explained that the non-importation agreements were not going to end until the Stamp Act was repealed. A member of Parliament asked Franklin how the colonists would react if troops were sent to enforce the Stamp Act. Franklin replied evenly that the troops would find no rebellion to suppress because no one would be buying stamps. But if they were sent to force the colonists to buy stamps, then, he said, they might find a rebellion indeed. The testimony was a sensation. It was printed in newspapers across Britain and America. Franklin became the most famous American in the empire, the man who had stood before Parliament and spoken truth to power. In March of 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. The news reached America in May, and the colonies erupted in celebration. Church bells rang, bonfires were lit, toasts were drunk to the King, to Parliament, to Rockingham, to Franklin. The crisis was over. The empire had been saved. Except that it had not been saved. It had been wounded, and the wound was self-inflicted. Because on the very same day that Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, it also passed the Declaratory Act. And the Declaratory Act was, in its own quiet way, far more dangerous to the future of the empire than the Stamp Act had ever been. The Declaratory Act was a simple piece of legislation. It asserted that Parliament had the full power and authority to make laws binding the American colonies in all cases whatsoever. It did not impose any specific taxes. It did not require any specific action. It was, supposedly, a face-saving measure, a way for Parliament to retreat on the specifics of the Stamp Act while preserving the principle of its authority. But in preserving the principle, Parliament had laid down a claim that made further conflict inevitable. Because the colonists had not merely objected to the Stamp Act itself, they had objected to the entire premise that Parliament could legislate for them without their consent. And the Declaratory Act explicitly and uncompromisingly reasserted that very premise. The colonists, in their celebrations, largely ignored the Declaratory Act. They had won. The Stamp Act was dead. Why worry about an abstract statement of principle? The practical victory was what mattered. This was a mistake. The Declaratory Act was a time bomb, buried in the foundation of the imperial relationship, ticking quietly. The colonists had won a battle over a specific tax, but they had lost the war over the constitutional question at the heart of the dispute. And Parliament, having retreated once, was determined that it would never retreat again. Within a year of the Stamp Act's repeal, Parliament would pass the Townshend Acts, new taxes on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. The colonial reaction would be familiar: outrage, non-importation, protest. British troops would be sent to Boston to enforce order. In 1770, those troops would fire on a crowd, killing 5. The cycle of escalation would continue, each confrontation more violent than the last, each resolution more fragile, until the only resolution left was war. But that is getting ahead of our story. What matters about the Stamp Act, what makes it one of the truly transformative events in American history, is not merely that it was repealed. It is what the colonists learned in the process of repealing it. They learned that they could organize across colonial boundaries. The Stamp Act Congress was a prototype of the Continental Congress that would, a decade later, declare independence. The committees of correspondence that formed to coordinate resistance became the nervous system of a new political order. The Sons of Liberty, a loosely organized network of protest groups, demonstrated that ordinary colonists, merchants, artisans, laborers, could exert real political power. They learned that economic pressure worked. The non-importation agreements proved that the colonies had leverage. Britain needed American markets as much as the Americans needed British goods. This was not the relationship of a master and a servant. It was an interdependent relationship, and interdependence meant that the colonists had power if they were willing to use it. And perhaps most importantly, they learned that they could win. The Stamp Act had seemed in the summer of 1765 like an immovable fact of imperial power. The most powerful empire in the world had passed a law, and that law was supposed to be obeyed. But the colonists had refused to obey. They had organized, protested, and brought economic pressure to bear. And they had forced Parliament to retreat. This was a revelation. It changed how the colonists saw themselves. They were no longer supplicants petitioning a distant government for relief. They were a political force capable of shaping their own destiny. The Stamp Act crisis had, for the first time, given the American colonies a collective identity. They were not merely British subjects living in America, they were Americans. And the British, for their part, had learned a very different lesson. They had learned that the colonists were ungrateful, that they did not appreciate the sacrifices Britain had made on their behalf, and that they would resist any attempt to impose order on the empire. The British political class emerged from the Stamp Act crisis not with a spirit of compromise, but with a grim determination that the next time they asserted their authority, they would not back down. Two peoples, once bound by a shared identity and a common allegiance, were beginning to see each other as adversaries. The Stamp Act was repealed, but the questions it raised could not be unanswered. Who had the right to govern the American colonies? Parliament, claiming absolute authority over the empire, or the colonies themselves through their own elected assemblies? The Declaratory Act gave Britain's answer. The colonial resistance gave America's. And between those two answers, there was no middle ground. The Stamp Act was a tax on paper, but what it actually taxed was patience. Britain ran out of it. The colonists discovered theirs, and the empire, which had seemed so permanent, so unshakable, so destined to endure forever, had taken its first step toward dissolution.